I am 33 years old, and I'm an amateur photographer, not professional but serious enough to travel alone in search of different landscapes. Last month, I rented a simple house on a small island in Washington state, near the San Juan Islands region. The idea was to spend 3 days isolated, photographing the sunrise, the morning fog, and the rocky coastline. The island is small. The last ferry leaves at 6 p.m., and after that only the permanent residents remain. According to the homeowner, no more than 20 people. I arrived on the 5:30 p.m. ferry, almost the last one of the day. The crossing was calm, cold wind, clear sky, that typical salty coastal smell. When I disembarked, I could already feel the different kind of silence compared to the mainland. Fewer cars, fewer lights, less movement. The house I rented was about a 10-minute walk from the public pier, on a narrow gravel road. On the second night of my stay, everything was completely silent after 10 p.m. I had spent the entire day walking around the island with my camera, so I was exhausted. I made something simple for dinner and sat by the living room window reviewing photos on my laptop. Outside, all I could hear was the light wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of water hitting the rocks. Around midnight, I turned off the living room lights and went to the bedroom, which faced toward the pier side. The bedroom was cold, so I left the portable heater running on low. I was almost asleep when I heard something that didn't fit the island's normal sound pattern. An engine, not loud but clear enough to identify. A boat engine approaching slowly. I sat up in bed immediately. The sound was distant but getting closer. It was the steady, low hum of a small motor, not a large boat. I listened for about 30 seconds, trying to decide if it could be a resident returning late, but that didn't make sense. The ferry had stopped hours earlier, and the water around the island is usually dark and dangerous at night. Besides, until then, I hadn't seen any movement at the pier after sunset. I got up slowly and went to the bedroom window. The curtain was thin, so I opened just a small gap, careful not to make noise. Cold air hit my face. Outside, the darkness was almost total, with only a few dim lights near the public pier. Even so, I could see the reflection of the water shifting and for a few seconds a low shadow approaching the dock. The engine slowed and then stopped. The silence that followed felt even heavier, as if the entire island had gone on alert. Then I saw a light moving on the pier, a flashlight. It wasn't the fixed lamp on the post, it was a directed beam swinging side to side like someone searching for something or checking moorings. My stomach tightened because it didn't look like someone casually walking around. It was purposeful, practical. The flashlight paused at specific points as if the person was working. I stood at the window, still holding the curtain, trying to hear more details. The wind carried a smell of gasoline mixed with sea salt. I heard a short metallic sound like chain hitting metal, and then footsteps on the wooden pier. I watched for several more seconds, trying to understand what that person was doing there at that hour. The flashlight moved to the end of the pier, stayed still for a moment, then turned off completely. Darkness took over again. I could still hear small noises, footsteps on wet wood, but I couldn't see anything anymore. My first thought was that maybe it was a resident dealing with some kind of emergency. Still, it was strange that no one had mentioned private boats moving around after midnight. The island seemed too small for that kind of activity to go unnoticed. I stayed at the window for nearly a full minute, waiting for the engine to start again. It didn't. The boat seemed to remain there. I closed the curtain slowly and went back to bed, trying to convince myself it wasn't my problem. I was just passing through. I didn't know anyone, I had no reason to get involved in anything, but my body wouldn't relax. The silence felt heavy, like I was waiting for something to happen, and then it did. A sharp sound from the living room. Not loud, but unmistakable, someone testing the front door handle. I froze in bed, listening. A few seconds later, the handle moved again, this time with more force. The metal clicked softly. My blood ran cold. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make the wooden floor creak. The door handle moved again, now accompanied by firmer pressure against the door, as if someone was pushing to test whether it was truly locked. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it might be audible from outside. The house was simple, with a solid but old wooden door. I had locked it with the internal latch before bed, but in that moment I started doubting whether I had done it properly. I stood in the hallway between the bedroom and living room, listening. Silence for a few seconds. Then footsteps outside, not on the pier now, but on the gravel in front of the house. And then I heard something that made me completely freeze. A male voice, low but clear enough to pass through the door. He said my full name. Not a nickname. Not just my first name. First and last name. The pronunciation was correct. No hesitation. My stomach dropped instantly. The voice wasn't shouted. It was almost calm, like speaking to someone familiar. Then came the sentence, "We need to talk." There was no aggressive tone, no urgency. It was firm, controlled. A cold feeling ran down my spine because on that island I didn't know anyone. I had told no one except the homeowner that I would be there. I hadn't posted anything on social media about the trip. I stood there in the dark trying to decide what to do. I didn't respond. I didn't make a sound. The person outside stayed silent for a few seconds, then tested the handle again, more insistently. The metal vibrated against the door. I began looking for something to defend myself with, anything. I grabbed a camera tripod leaning against the wall. My hands were sweating and I could barely grip it properly. Outside, I heard footsteps move away a few meters, then return, as if he were circling the house. The gravel crunched under the weight of someone walking slowly. I stood motionless in the middle of the living room, gripping the tripod so tightly my fingers began to hurt. All the house lights were off, so I knew from outside he wouldn't be able to see me clearly. What unsettled me most was that he knew exactly who I was. He didn't ask, "Is anyone there?" He called my full name. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps heading toward the side of the house, where there was a small kitchen window. The glass vibrated slightly as if someone had placed a hand on it. I held my breath. I could smell the ocean coming through the cracks in the wood, mixed with something stronger like fresh fuel. Then I heard the voice again, closer to the side window. He repeated my name, lower this time, as if trying to sound calm. He said he knew I was inside and that he didn't want trouble. The way he spoke wasn't aggressive, but it was too controlled. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. It sounded like someone who had done this before. My entire body was on high alert. I tried to remember if I had left any exterior lights on that might reveal movement inside the house. I hadn't. Silence returned for a few seconds. Then I heard something different. A short metallic sound from the front of the house, like something being adjusted or repositioned. I moved slowly toward the living room window, staying out of direct view of the glass. I tilted my head slightly to catch a glimpse of any shadow without exposing myself. I didn't see the man, but I saw something that made me even more uneasy. A low silhouette moving near the porch as if someone was crouched down. It didn't look like he was trying to break in at that moment. It looked like he was waiting, or watching. A pressure in my chest refused to ease. I grabbed my phone and considered calling local police, but I remembered there was no permanent station on the island at night. Patrols came from the mainland and depended on the morning ferry. That made my stomach sink even further. I stood there, phone in hand, trying to decide whether to call anyway. Signal coverage on the island wasn't great, and I wasn't sure a patrol could arrive before dawn. Outside, the man spoke again, this time from a point slightly farther from the door. He said my full name again in the same controlled tone. Then he added that I knew why he was there. That made no sense. I had no problems with anyone, no debts, no recent conflicts. I was there just to photograph landscapes. The fact that he acted as if there was some history between us disturbed me most of all. He wasn't asking. He was stating. After a few seconds of silence, I heard the gravel crunch once more, this time moving away toward the road. I stood frozen, waiting to hear the boat engine again. It took a few minutes, but then I heard a distant click, followed by the low rumble of the engine starting. The sound echoed over the water and began to drift away slowly. I didn't move. I stayed in the dark living room for at least 5 minutes after the noise disappeared completely. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt different, as if something had been marked there. When I finally gathered the courage to approach the door, I didn't open it immediately. I looked through the small side gap in the window. The pier was dark, no flashlight moving. The sea looked calm as before. I waited until the first hint of light on the horizon, around 5 a.m., before stepping outside. The air was cold and damp. I walked carefully to the pier, gravel crunching under my feet, alert for any movement. When I got there, I saw clear signs of recent mooring on the wooden posts. The ropes had left fresh grooves in the salt residue. There was still a faint smell of fuel in the air. I stopped by the island's small grocery store when it opened and casually asked if anyone had taken a boat out during the night. The owner, who seemed to know everyone there, said no, that no one had reason to navigate after midnight. especially with that week's tide conditions. I mentioned hearing an engine. He shook his head and said it probably came from outside. And that's when I realized something. The person who stood in front of my house wasn't stuck there like I was. He didn't depend on the ferry. He came on purpose. He knew I would be there. He knew my full name. And he left when he realized I wouldn't open the door. What disturbs me most to this day isn't that he tried to get in. It's the idea that on that small isolated island, someone crossed the water in the middle of the night specifically to find me. Story 2. I am 28 years old, and last fall my girlfriend and I decided to rent a remote cabin on an isolated lake in northern Minnesota. The idea was to spend a weekend away from the city, with no cell signal, just nature, trails, and silence. Tourist season had already ended, so almost all the cabins around were empty. The owner sent us simple instructions by message saying he would leave the key inside a lockbox on the door. We drove almost 4 hours from Minneapolis until we reached a dirt road surrounded by trees that had nearly lost all their leaves. The lake was large and dark, surrounded by dense forest. There were no other houses visible from our cabin, just trees and water. The sky was overcast and the temperature had already started to drop when we arrived around 5 p.m. The first thing I found strange was that the door was locked as expected, but when I entered the code and opened it, I smelled faint smoke in the air. It wasn't strong, but it was recent enough not to seem old. The cabin was simple, a small living room with a stone fireplace, a compact kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. I put our backpacks on the floor and instinctively walked toward the fireplace. I held my hand near the stones and felt warmth. Not hot, but warm, too recent to be just old residue. My girlfriend asked jokingly if I had lit something before coming in. I said no. The wood inside the fireplace still had a faint glow of extinguished embers. That gave me a strange feeling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the owner had been there earlier to check on the place before our arrival. I stayed calm and looked around for something that would explain it. The cabin seemed tidy, nothing overturned, nothing out of place. But when we went into the kitchen to put away our groceries, my girlfriend opened the refrigerator and stood there in silence for a few seconds. I walked over and immediately saw what had made her freeze. There was an open pizza box on the top shelf with 2 slices missing. It wasn't old and moldy. The crust still looked soft. In the fridge door, there was a half-full bottle of juice and a small container of butter that had already been opened. None of it was ours. We had just arrived. I felt that tightening in my stomach again, the kind that happens when something doesn't fit, but you still try to force a logical explanation. I said maybe the owner had forgotten to clean before we arrived. But the more I spoke, the less convincing it sounded. The cabin was too organized to look neglected. There was no accumulated trash, no signs of abandonment. The food didn't look like it had been there for days. My girlfriend asked if we should call the owner immediately, but cell signal inside the cabin was almost non-existent. The only way to get a connection was to walk to a higher spot near the main trail. I looked out the kitchen window. The light was fading and the forest around us seemed denser as darkness settled in. I didn't want to go outside at that moment. I said maybe someone had used the cabin by mistake and left hours earlier, but the still warm fireplace didn't match that idea. I walked to the front door and opened it to feel the air outside. It was cold, that dry northern autumn cold, and the smell of damp leaves was strong. I looked at the wooden deck surrounding the cabin. The surface was partially damp from the mist forming over the lake. I didn't see anyone there at that moment. No cars parked besides ours, no lights on along the shore. The silence was deep, broken only by the distant sound of water gently hitting the rocks. I went back inside and locked the door with the internal latch. The feeling that we were occupying a space someone still considered theirs wouldn't leave my mind. We tried to act normally, turned on a few lights, switched on the small living room TV just to have background noise, started organizing our things. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the warm fireplace and the open food. Around 11 p.m., we were already in bed in the back bedroom. The wind outside occasionally made the trees crack, but it was the predictable sound of the forest. I was almost asleep when I heard something different. A sharp step on wood, coming from the deck. Not a tree cracking, weight on planks. My girlfriend heard it too because she shifted in bed at the same moment. We stayed silent, trying to confirm whether we had imagined it. The sound came again. One step, then another, slow, circling the cabin. I sat up immediately, heart racing. The bedroom was dark except for a faint light coming from the living room. The sound on the deck continued, spaced footsteps heavy enough not to be a small animal. I had heard raccoons before. This was different. It was the kind of weight that makes wood give slightly under a foot. My girlfriend gripped my arm tightly without saying a word. We listened. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, passing directly beneath the bedroom window. The glass vibrated very faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to confirm someone was very close. I got up slowly and moved toward the bedroom door, trying not to make the wooden floor creak. The sound shifted position again, as if circling the front of the cabin. There was no running, no urgency, just someone walking slowly, maybe looking at the windows. A real chill ran down my spine. The warm fireplace, the open food, and now footsteps on the deck in the middle of the night. This was no longer coincidence. I grabbed my phone to call the owner. Miraculously, one weak bar of signal appeared near the living room window. I dialed while the footsteps continued outside, growing closer to the front door. He answered after a few rings, sounding sleepy. I tried to speak quietly but firmly, explaining that the fireplace was warm when we arrived, that there was open food in the fridge, and that now someone was walking on the deck. He was silent for a few seconds. Then he said that was impossible. According to him, no one had been at the cabin for weeks. He said he had personally closed everything and that there were no other bookings. While he was speaking, I clearly heard 3 footsteps outside the front door. The deck made a hollow sound like someone standing right there. I stared at the door handle, expecting it to move. It didn't. But the steps stayed there motionless for a few seconds, like whoever was outside was listening too. The owner insisted it might be a larger animal, like a deer, which sometimes climbs onto the deck seeking shelter. I almost laughed nervously. That wasn't the sound of hooves. It was a human step. While I was still on the phone, the sound began moving again, this time toward the back of the cabin where the kitchen window was. My girlfriend stood behind me, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. The owner said he couldn't get there before dawn because he lived nearly an hour away. He repeated that no one should be there, and that the area's trails were rarely used outside tourist season. Before hanging up, he told us to lock the doors tightly and stay inside until morning. We stood in the middle of the living room, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin once more. With each round, it felt like the person was checking every window. At one point, we heard something closer to the back door, like someone leaning weight against the wood. It wasn't a clear attempt to break in. It felt more like a test, a light push evaluating resistance. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a kitchen knife, more out of reflex than a real plan. After several minutes that felt much longer, the footsteps moved away. The sound shifted from the deck to the leaves on the ground, and then complete silence. We didn't sleep again. We sat in the living room with all the lights on until the sky began to lighten. When we finally stepped outside in the morning, the air was cold and damp. The deck had clear marks of wet boots, not light animal prints. They were wide with defined tread patterns, circling the entire cabin. We followed the footprints to the side where the deck ended. They descended to the dirt and leaf-covered ground and led toward the forest behind the cabin. We walked several meters following the trail, hearts still racing. The prints went straight into the trees. But what made me stop was realizing there were no footprints returning toward the main trail, no marks heading back toward the road, just a one-way path disappearing into the dense forest. The owner arrived about an hour later. He examined the footprints, the fireplace, and the food in the refrigerator. He repeated that no one had been there, but his expression wasn't as confident as his voice had been the night before. He also couldn't explain why the wood in the fireplace was still warm when we arrived. What disturbs me most isn't that someone walked on the deck. It's knowing that when we opened the door that afternoon, the cabin was already being used. And whoever had been there before us didn't leave completely. They just stepped out of sight, went into the forest, and stayed close enough to return after dark. Story 3. I am 36 years old, and my family owns a small private island off the coast of South Carolina. Something my grandfather bought decades ago when the area was still undervalued. It's nothing luxurious, just a simple wooden house raised on stilts, a few trees bent by the sea wind, and a small pier that extends a few meters over the shallow water. The only access is by a small aluminum boat with a small motor. tied to the pier with a thick rope secured to a wooden post. I usually go there alone a few times a year to fish and disconnect from the city. That particular weekend I was completely alone. No visible neighbors, no other structures nearby. Just water, sand, and constant wind. I arrived late in the afternoon and tied the boat the way I always do, with a simple but firm knot I learned from my father as a child. I checked it twice before going up to the house. The tide was low, and the boat was almost touching the sand. I spent the rest of the day organizing a few things, fishing near the pier, and preparing something simple for dinner. When night fell, the dominant sounds were the slow movement of water and the wind passing through the boards of the house. I was used to those noises. I always sleep well there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a different sound, a sharp, repetitive impact. Hull against wood. I sat up immediately, still half disoriented, trying to understand if it was a dream. The sound came again, louder now, with a regular interval, hitting the wood of the pier, pulling back, hitting again. My first thought was the tide rising and the boat rocking more than usual. But I knew that rhythm, and this felt more aggressive, like the boat was partially loose and being pushed by the water's movement. I got up quickly, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the front door. The early morning air was damp and cold, the salty smell strong. The darkness was almost complete, with only faint moonlight reflecting on the sea. I walked across the deck toward the pier, hearing the boards creak under my feet. When I reached the end of the pier and shone the light on the boat, my stomach dropped. It had drifted away from the post, pulled several meters out, still attached by a piece of rope, but not at the point where I had tied it. The rope was loose, partially dragging in the water. I pulled the boat closer and immediately knew it hadn't happened because of wind. The knot hadn't slipped. It had been undone. The end of the rope was clean, the loop carefully unraveled, as if someone had untied it calmly and deliberately. My knot is always tight, and even with tide and wind, it doesn't come undone on its own. I stood there for a few seconds holding the wet rope, feeling cold water splash against my hand, trying to accept what that meant. Someone had been there while I was sleeping. I retied the knot immediately, this time adding 2 extra loops and pulling hard until I felt the rope bite into the wooden post. While doing it, my ears were alert to any sound beyond the water. The tide was rising, but there wasn't enough wind to justify the boat drifting that way. I stood on the pier for a few seconds, shining the light over the surrounding water, trying to see if another boat was nearby. Nothing visible, no distant flashlight, no engine running, no unusual reflection on the dark surface, just the steady sound of small waves hitting the sand and the hull now firm against the wood. I was starting to think maybe someone had passed by boat near the island and decided to mess with mine as a prank, or out of malice, when I heard something that froze me in place. A quick, irregular sound from the sand behind the house, not the constant rhythm of water. Lighter, faster, footsteps. I swung the flashlight toward the beach, but the raised house blocked part of the view. The sound seemed to come from the backside of the island, where there's a narrow stretch of sand before the vegetation begins. It wasn't the heavy sound of someone walking casually. It was a short run, like someone trying to move away quickly after being noticed. My heart began beating harder than when I saw the loosened boat, because in that moment everything fit together in a way I didn't want it to. Someone had gone to the pier while I was asleep, carefully untied the knot, let the boat drift partially away, and for some reason hadn't completed whatever they intended, or had been interrupted by the sound of the hull hitting the wood and waking me up. The idea that someone had tried to leave me without a means of escape before approaching the house made my throat go dry instantly. I stepped off the pier and walked toward the sand, shining the flashlight ahead. I moved carefully across the damp wood and onto the beach behind the house. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing uneven sand and a few old bird tracks. I walked several meters, trying to locate exactly where the footsteps had come from. Then I saw it clearly enough to know it wasn't my imagination. Recent marks in the damp sand parallel to the waterline, heading toward the darker part of the vegetation. They weren't deep, but they were too wide to belong to a small animal. The pattern was human, probably sneakers or light boots. The trail came from the direction of the pier and led behind the house. The air felt heavier in my lungs. I followed the light toward the vegetation, where sand mixed with dirt and exposed roots. There the prints became less defined, but still visible enough to show someone had been running, not walking slowly. The spacing between the prints indicated urgency. I stopped a few meters from the tree line. The vegetation there is dense, filled with low shrubs and dry branches that make noise when stepped on. I strained to hear any movement from within the brush. The wind was weak, so any motion should have been noticeable. At first, absolute silence, then a faint snap of a branch being pressed and released. I didn't go into the vegetation. The idea of entering alone in the dark, knowing someone could be a few meters away, felt too reckless. Instead, I stepped back slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed at the trees. My mind tried to organize the facts logically. The island is small. There's no road access. The only way to get there is by boat. I was sleeping. The boat was carefully untied. The person ran when the hull noise woke me. This wasn't random. This was planning. I walked slowly back to the house, every muscle tense. I climbed the steps and locked the door with the internal latch and the extra lock I rarely use. I stood in the dark living room, listening. My heartbeat sounded too loud. I wiped my face and realized I was sweating despite the cold breeze coming through the cracks. I knew that if someone was still on the island, they were probably moving slowly now, waiting for me to go back to sleep or trying to determine whether I had realized their plan. I went to the side window of the house that faces the back of the island and turned off the flashlight so I wouldn't reveal my position. That's when I heard another sound, more distant, coming from the waterline on the opposite side of the pier. A faint noise of something being pushed across wet sand, then a very low metallic click, followed by a small engine trying to start. My stomach dropped completely. Someone had another boat hidden on the opposite side of the island. The engine failed the first attempt, made a short sputtering sound, then caught. The noise began moving away slowly, circling the island along the darker side, away from the main pier. I remained motionless until the engine hum disappeared entirely. I couldn't go back to bed. I sat in a chair in the living room with a kitchen knife within reach, staring at the door as if it might move at any moment. The boat was tied again, but now I knew someone had been there while I slept. The tide continued rising, water gently striking beneath the pier. I didn't hear any more footsteps in the sand, but that didn't calm me. What unsettled me was the logical sequence. Someone came to the island in the middle of the night, carefully untied my only means of escape, and only failed to finish whatever they intended because the hull hit the wood and woke me. When the sky began to lighten, I went back to the pier. The boat was exactly where I had left it. The knot I retied remained intact, but in the sand behind the house, the footprints were clearer in the morning light. They came from the opposite side of the island, passed near the pier, circled behind the house, and then returned toward the point where I had heard the engine. There was a second set of marks near the waterline, deeper, like someone had dragged something heavy for several meters before pushing it into the sea. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the empty horizon. No boat visible anywhere, no nearby island close enough to justify a casual visit. The person who had been there wasn't lost, wasn't seeking shelter by accident. They knew I was alone. They knew the boat was my only access to the mainland, and they tried to remove it before approaching the house. To this day, when I return to that island, the first thing I do isn't open the house door. It's check the boat's knot, because that night I learned the danger wasn't someone running across the sand. It was the care with which the knot had been untied. Story 4. I am 31 years old, and last summer a friend and I rented a small house on an isolated peninsula on the Oregon coast to spend a weekend fishing and photographing the landscape. The place is practically deserted outside of peak season. The only structure besides the house where we stayed is an old lighthouse that was deactivated decades ago. It stands about 300 meters from the house on a rocky rise facing the ocean. It no longer functions as a regular tourist site. And according to the homeowner, internal access was closed for safety reasons. The peninsula is narrow with a single dirt road that ends there. After that, there's only sea, sand, and constant wind. We arrived in the late afternoon, parked the car next to the house, and unloaded our backpacks. The first night was calm to a certain extent. The wind was strong, typical of that region, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a continuous heavy sound. We ate something simple and sat on the porch looking at the lighthouse in the distance, a dark silhouette against the cloudy sky. There was no light in it as expected. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to use the bathroom and passed by the living room window before going back to the bedroom. That's when I noticed something that didn't match what I had seen earlier. There was a faint light flashing inside the lighthouse structure. It wasn't at the main top, but from one of the side windows halfway up the tower. At first I thought it was a reflection from the ocean or some effect of the wind, but the light moved. It wasn't static. It was a flashlight. I quietly called my friend in the bedroom, but he took a while to wake up. Meanwhile, I stood in the living room, my face almost pressed against the cold window glass, trying to make sure of what I was seeing. The light inside the lighthouse didn't stay on continuously. It appeared, swept across part of the window as if someone were pointing it downward, and then disappeared. It came back a few seconds later at a different angle, as if the person was moving inside. My stomach tightened because it didn't look like tourist lighting, nor car lights, nor anything coming from the road. It was internal. It was someone inside with a flashlight, and the way the beam moved wasn't playful. It was slow and methodical. The kind of movement you make when you're trying to see something specific in the dark. I felt a strange tension in my body, like when you realize someone might be looking back at you. The wind hit the house in gusts and made the wood creak lightly, but that sound was constant and expected. The light in the lighthouse wasn't. When my friend finally woke up, he walked sleepily into the living room, and I pointed toward the lighthouse without speaking loudly. He stared for a few seconds and immediately stopped joking that it must be a reflection, because the light appeared again, clearly, and this time it swept across the window and then lowered as if the person was pointing the flashlight outward toward the ground around the lighthouse. My friend's expression tightened, and he asked if the lighthouse wasn't deactivated. I said it was, and that the owner had told us it was closed. We stood there in silence, watching those short flashes. At one point, the light stayed off long enough for me to think it was over. Then it came back, but lower now, as if the person had gone down a few internal steps and was shining it through another window. It felt like someone had been moving around inside long enough to know the structure well. My mouth went dry. It wasn't fear of something supernatural. It was the real fear of someone using that lighthouse as shelter, awake in the middle of the night with a reason not to be seen. We watched for a few more minutes, trying to decide whether it required immediate action or if we were overreacting. The problem was that the peninsula was too small to ignore any movement like that. That light wasn't just inside the lighthouse. At one point, it clearly pointed toward the side of the peninsula, where our house stood. The beam passed across the lower part of the tower and seemed to sweep the ground ahead as if testing distance. I felt pressure in my chest instantly. My friend muttered something like, "He can see the house from there," and it was true. From the top of the lighthouse, anyone would have a direct view of the only inhabited structure there. There were no tall trees blocking the line of sight, just sand, low vegetation, and the sea. The light stayed still for a few seconds, pointed downward, and then disappeared completely. The lighthouse returned to being a dark silhouette. We tried to rationalize. Maybe someone was illegally camping inside. Maybe a fisherman had found temporary shelter. But that didn't explain why the light had swept the area as if searching for something. We went to the front door and opened it slowly, just enough to hear the outside environment better. The wind had weakened at that moment, and the sound of the sea was steady. We didn't hear footsteps or voices from the lighthouse. No boat engine, nothing but the natural surroundings. Even so, the feeling that someone had been active there just seconds earlier wouldn't leave our minds. We closed and locked the door again. I checked the car through the side window just to make sure it was as we had left it. In the darkness, it seemed normal. We went back inside, but neither of us felt like sleeping anymore. We sat in the living room with the lights off, only faint moonlight coming through the windows. Maybe 20 minutes passed in absolute silence. That's when we heard something much closer, a soft muffled sound coming from the sand around the house. It wasn't wind, it was weight, controlled footsteps. My friend turned his head toward me instantly because we both heard it. It wasn't running. It was slow walking, like someone circling the house. The sound came from the side where the car was parked. The ground there wasn't wooden like the porch. It was compacted sand mixed with small stones. The noise was different but unmistakable. We stayed completely still, trying to pinpoint the exact direction. The sound wasn't coming from the lighthouse anymore. It was too close. I heard a firmer step followed by a brief pause, as if the person had stopped to observe something. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it vibrated in my throat. My friend gestured for us to turn off any remaining light in the house, minimal as it was. We stayed in total darkness, staring at the side window facing the car. After a few seconds, we saw something that confirmed the worst. A shadow passed quickly across the outside of the glass. It wasn't wind. It was someone crossing the window's field of view. The movement was fast but clear enough not to be imagination. I crawled carefully toward the window and looked through a tiny gap in the curtain. The car was there, but the driver's side door looked slightly misaligned. Not fully open, but not fully closed like we had left it. I was absolutely certain I had shut it with the normal click. Now it looked as if it was merely resting closed. My stomach dropped. There was no flashlight visible at that moment, but footprints in the sand were faintly visible under the weak moonlight. There were fresh marks around the car, circling the house and heading toward the back part of the peninsula. We didn't hear more footsteps then, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence you feel when someone is standing just a few meters away waiting. We stayed there for several minutes trying to decide whether to go outside and check or remain locked in until dawn. There was no reliable cell signal there. The road was the only land exit, and anyone on the peninsula would know exactly where we were. I thought about the lighthouse. I thought about the beam sweeping the area earlier, and everything started to feel connected. Someone up there had seen the house was occupied, then came down, then approached. We didn't have the courage to go out at that moment. We sat in the living room until the sky began to lighten slowly on the horizon. When we finally had enough light to see the ground clearly, we opened the door carefully and stepped outside. The sand around the house had clear and recent footprints. They weren't ours. They were from boots or thick-soled sneakers. They circled the entire house, passed by the car, and headed toward the trail leading to the lighthouse. The car door was indeed just resting closed. When I opened it, I noticed the driver's seat had been adjusted a few centimeters backward. Nothing had been stolen, but someone had clearly gotten inside. We followed the footprints to the base of the lighthouse. The outer door was closed but not locked as the homeowner had guaranteed. We pushed it open carefully. The interior smelled of mold and old wood, but there was also a more recent scent, like damp fabric and food. On the floor there was a sleeping bag rolled up against the inner wall, and a small box with empty canned food packages. We climbed a few steps of the spiral staircase cautiously. There were fresh marks in the accumulated dust. This wasn't a tourist visit. It was regular use. Someone was sleeping there. When we reached the side window from which we had seen the light, the view was directly toward the house where we were staying. The line of sight was unobstructed. Someone could stand there for hours observing who came and went. The flashlight we saw wasn't a reflection. It wasn't random. It was someone awake in the middle of the night, active, moving inside an abandoned structure, watching the only inhabited house on the peninsula, and then coming down to get closer. Story 5. I am 42 years old and I've been fishing on the Mississippi since I was a teenager. I'm not a professional, but I grew up in southern Missouri and have always liked spending a night or two on small river islands, the kind that appear when the water level drops a bit. They're not official islands with infrastructure, just large sandbars with a few crooked trees and low vegetation. That weekend, I decided to cross over with my small boat to one of those islands to spend the night alone fishing for catfish. I brought a simple tent, a flashlight, food, and a portable radio I used to follow weather forecasts and river traffic. The radio picks up local broadcasts and sometimes communications from more distant commercial vessels. The river was relatively calm that night, just the constant sound of the current and insects around me. I set up the tent a little away from the shore on a slightly elevated patch of sand to avoid any sudden change in the water level. I tied the boat to a sturdy log and checked the knot twice before heading up to the drier part of the island. The sky was clear, only a few clouds, and the only natural light came from the moon reflecting off the river. There were no other boats visible along that stretch. The opposite bank was a good distance away, dark and nearly invisible at that hour. Around 11:30 p.m., I sat near the tent with the radio playing quietly, just to have background noise while I cleaned some fishing gear. The static came and went, as it always does there, because the signal fluctuates a lot. I turned the dial a few times trying to find the weather station, the one that usually repeats wind alerts and river levels during the night. I found a channel with a distant but weak voice and left it there. The static was constant, that hissing sound that eventually becomes part of the environment if you listen long enough. The radio was on the ground near my knee and I was handling hooks and lines with the flashlight resting on a box. That's when, in the middle of the static, I heard a male voice come through for a second. It wasn't the standard station voice. It was different, closer, like someone speaking directly into a microphone. At first, I thought it was interference from some commercial vessel, because sometimes they cross into the channel by mistake. But then the voice said my name. My first name, exactly the way people call me. No mistake, no hesitation. I froze instantly, the fishing line still in my hand, as if my body had shut down for a second. The static returned, and I tried to understand whether I had really heard that. I lowered my head and brought the radio closer to my ear, turning up the volume slightly. My heart was beating faster, and I tried to control my breathing to make sure it wasn't my mind filling gaps in the noise. The static continued. Then the voice came back, clearer this time. It said my name again and spoke a short sentence. "Come down to the shore." It wasn't polite. It wasn't playful. It was a simple order, as if the person knew I was listening and expected obedience. I automatically looked around, sweeping the island with the flashlight. Just low trees and sand. No lights, no engine, no other sound besides the river. There was no boat in sight. And yet the radio had just spoken to me as if someone were nearby. I turned off the radio on instinct, as if that could interrupt whatever was happening. The silence that followed felt too heavy, just the river flowing and insects around me. I sat there trying to rationalize. Maybe someone was transmitting from the opposite bank. Maybe another fisherman had somehow picked up my name on a different frequency and was joking. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't said my name out loud. No one was with me. And the way the voice sounded wasn't distant like marine radio usually does. It was too close, too controlled. I looked toward the shoreline, where the dark water moved under the moonlight. I saw nothing. That's when I heard the first impact. A sharp crack in the sand a few meters from me. A small stone had been thrown in my direction. It hit the ground and rolled a few inches. My whole body reacted instantly. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the shoreline. Nothing. The river looked the same. Before I could process it, another stone came. This one thrown harder, landing near the box where I had been sitting. It wasn't big enough to cause serious harm, but it wasn't a twig blown by the wind. It was thrown with intent. I stood up quickly, feeling the cold sand under my boots, and began shining the light more intensely along the waterline. My heart was racing and my mouth was dry. I couldn't see anyone, but the stones were clearly coming from the direction of the shore, not from the interior of the island. I took a few steps backward, trying to gain distance from the water. The radio was still off on the ground, but I felt as if someone was still on the other side, waiting for my reaction. I heard no boat engine, no oars, no breathing, just the constant sound of the current. Then for a few seconds, everything went completely quiet. No stones, no voice, just darkness. I stood there, flashlight pointed at the waterline, forcing my eyes to adjust beyond the beam's reach. The shore was only a few meters away, but the darkness of the water created an almost invisible line between sand and river. My ears strained for any change in the current. That's when I heard something different, a slight movement in the water, as if someone had stepped into the shallow part near the shore. It wasn't the continuous sound of the current. It was isolated, the kind of sound you make when you step into ankle-deep water and the sand shifts under your weight. My stomach dropped. The idea of someone standing in the water, in the darkness watching me, was worse than the voice on the radio. I aimed the flashlight slightly to the left, slowly sweeping the shoreline. That's when I saw a silhouette. Not completely clear, but defined enough not to be imagination. A vertical shape standing at the waterline a few meters away where sand met river. It didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. It just stood there. The moon's reflection on the water outlined part of its shape, but the face was impossible to distinguish. A surge of adrenaline hit so hard that my hands began to shake. I called out loudly, asking who was there. No response. The silhouette remained still for several seconds that felt far too long. I took a step backward, keeping the flashlight trained on it. That's when the figure made a quick movement, almost like a sideways retreat, and disappeared beyond the edge of the light. I didn't hear running on the sand. I didn't hear a clear splash into the water. Just a brief shift and then nothing. Silence took over again. I stood there trying to hear breathing, paddling, anything. Nothing. My body was on full alert. I backed up toward the tent without fully turning my back to the shoreline. I picked up the radio and turned it on again, almost impulsively. The static returned louder now, maybe because I had raised the volume earlier. I waited, nothing. Then, in the middle of the static, the voice appeared once more. Lower now, as if smiling while speaking. It said my name again, and then just one word. Alone. The radio went back to hissing as if nothing had happened. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I turned it off again and threw it inside the tent, as if that could silence whatever was using that frequency. I didn't approach the shoreline again. I stayed near the tent, flashlight pointed ahead and my fishing knife in the other hand. The night seemed darker than before, as if the moon had slipped behind clouds. The wind began to blow stronger, moving the leaves of the low trees and creating shadows that confused my peripheral vision. Every sound now felt amplified. Every distant snap made my body react as if another stone were coming my way. But the stones didn't return. What returned was the sense of presence. I couldn't see the silhouette anymore, but I had the clear impression that someone was still there near the water, waiting for me to make the mistake of getting closer. I stayed there for hours, too afraid to lie down. The radio remained off inside the tent. I didn't want to hear anything else from it. The river's sound was constant, but occasionally I thought I heard something moving in the shallows beyond the flashlight's reach. When the sky began to lighten, a faint gray replaced the absolute black of night. The fear didn't disappear, but the visibility brought some control. I walked slowly toward the shoreline, now using the growing natural light to see the ground. That's when I saw the marks, clear footprints in the damp sand coming from the waterline toward where I had been sitting. They were recent, the edges still defined. They weren't mine. The pattern suggested someone barefoot or wearing thin soles, hard to tell, but human. The footprints came within a few meters of the tent and then turned back toward the river. I followed the trail to the water. There, the prints blended into the shallow part of the river and disappeared. There was no sign of a boat tide nearby, no hull marks in the sand, no rower visible on the horizon, just the river continuing its course as if nothing had happened. I looked across the entire island, trying to imagine where that person could have come from. There had been no other boat visible all night, and yet someone had been there, thrown stones, spoken my name over the radio, and stood at the shore watching me. I packed up the tent earlier than planned. I didn't wait out the morning. As I gathered my things, I kept glancing at the radio, as if it might turn on by itself at any moment. What marked me most wasn't the silhouette in the water. Story 6. I am 30 years old, and last year I needed to step away from many things at once. Personal problems, accumulated work, a complicated breakup. I didn't want anyone to know where I was, not even my closest friends. So I rented an isolated house on a sparsely inhabited peninsula in Nova Scotia for a few days. The place was remote enough that the cell signal was weak and the access road was practically a gravel trail. The real estate agency sent me the coordinates and a code for a lockbox with the key on the porch. I didn't share the address with anyone. I didn't post anything on social media. The house faced the sea with a small wooden deck at the back and nothing but water and rocks in front. The second night was when everything happened. I had spent the day walking along the peninsula trying to clear my head. The constant wind made a low humming sound against the windows, but nothing that bothered me. Around 11:40 p.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at my phone, not doing anything specific, just scrolling through old messages I had no intention of answering. The house was completely silent except for the distant sound of waves hitting the rocks. That's when my phone vibrated with a message notification from an unknown number. I wasn't expecting anything from anyone. When I opened it, I felt an immediate chill in my stomach. It was a photo of the house where I was staying, taken from the water. The image clearly showed the back of the house, the wooden deck, and the faint kitchen light on, exactly as it was at that moment. The angle indicated the photo had been taken from the water, maybe from a low boat a few meters away from the rocky shore. The framing was far too precise to be coincidence. I immediately recognized the reflection of the living room window and the position of the small side staircase leading down to the rocks. My first reaction was to think it was edited or some kind of prank, but the interior light was the same one I was seeing around me. There was no text, just the photo. My heart started pounding, the kind you feel in your neck. I stood up from the chair and went carefully to the kitchen window, turning off the light before approaching the glass. Outside was dark, but not completely. The moon partially reflected on the surface of the water, creating irregular glimmers across the small waves. I strained my eyes to see any silhouette of a boat nearby. I saw nothing clear. No navigation lights. No engine sound. The sea was relatively calm, just the constant sound of water against rocks. My phone vibrated again in my hand, making me almost drop it. Another message from the same number. This time just a short sentence. "Don't you remember me?" My stomach tightened even more. I tried to remember if I had met anyone in the area, if someone could have followed me, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't told anyone where I was. I was still deciding whether to respond when I heard the first knock on the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. 3 spaced knocks like someone calmly rapping their knuckles against the wood. My entire body reacted at once. The front door was just a few meters from where I stood. I hadn't heard an engine. I hadn't heard footsteps on the gravel road. The only way someone could arrive without making noise would be from the water, climbing the rocks behind the house and circling around to the main entrance. The knock came again, slightly firmer. I stood completely still, trying to hear anything beyond my own heartbeat. The silence outside was absolute. Then I heard it. A male voice, low and controlled, from the other side of the door. He said, "Don't you remember me?" The same text as the message. The tone wasn't aggressive. It wasn't shouting. It was almost intimate, like he was speaking to someone familiar who had taken too long to recognize him. A cold sensation climbed up my spine. The way he spoke suggested he was alone. There was no urgency, no immediate attempt to force the door. Just presence. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. I held the phone so tightly my fingers began to ache. The wood of the house creaked slightly in the wind, but the voice continued from outside, now a little closer to the handle. He turned the doorknob once. The metallic sound was short, a test. I had locked it before dark, but at that moment I mentally checked whether I had really turned the latch fully. The handle returned to its original position. The voice spoke again, saying he knew I was inside. It wasn't a direct threat. It was a statement. My phone vibrated once more. Another message from the same number. I didn't want to look, but I did. It was another photo, this time of the front of the house taken from porch height. I recognized the welcome mat at the entrance. That image had been taken seconds earlier. A heavy pressure built in my chest when I saw that second photo. The angle showed the exact door behind which I was standing, with the interior light already off. That meant he had come close enough to photograph the entrance and send it in real time. And he was still there. Outside. I immediately switched my phone to silent mode, afraid any vibration might give away my position. Outside, the man stepped back. I heard the sole of his shoe on the wooden porch. He took a deep breath, loud enough to carry through the door, and spoke again in the same calm tone. "I just want to talk." There was no urgency in his voice. That made it worse. I took a few steps backward, moving away from the direct line of the door. The house was simple. A small living room connected to the kitchen and a narrow hallway to the bedroom. There was no easy alternative exit besides the back deck, which led directly to rocks and the sea. I thought about running there, but if he had come by water, he was probably watching the back as well. My brain tried to build a plan while my body remained rigid. The man tested the doorknob again, this time longer, as if evaluating the latch's resistance. The wood vibrated slightly. He stopped again. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps circling the side of the house. The sound shifted from the wooden porch to the uneven stone of the surrounding ground. He was heading to the back, toward the deck facing the sea. My stomach dropped. I walked slowly to the kitchen and turned off the small light still on there. I stood in complete darkness, trying to listen more carefully. The wind blew stronger at that moment, making the windows vibrate slightly. Then I heard the clear sound of wet feet climbing the 2 steps of the back deck. It wasn't rain. It was water transferring from sole to wood. I held my breath when I heard the first step on the deck behind the house. He wasn't running. He wasn't nervous. The step was firm and controlled, like someone comfortable in the environment. He stopped right behind the kitchen wall. I could almost feel his presence on the other side. Then came something worse than the previous voice. A light tap on the glass of the back door, not hard enough to break it, but enough to remind me there was only a thin layer between us. I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen in total darkness, trying to control my breathing. The sea wind hit the exterior walls, but I could clearly distinguish the sound coming from the back deck. It wasn't wind. It was human weight shifting on wet wood. He had come through the water. That meant there was a boat nearby, probably with the engine off, drifting silently or anchored just beyond the immediate view from the window. The idea of someone crossing the sea in the middle of the night without visible light, just to reach that isolated house, made my throat go dry. I wasn't being followed by accident. This was intentional. The tap on the back glass came again, firmer this time, but still controlled. It wasn't an immediate break-in attempt. It was a test, psychological pressure. I slowly crouched behind the kitchen counter, out of the direct line of the door even though the lights were off. My phone was still in my hand and I thought about calling the local police, but the peninsula was nearly 40 minutes from the nearest town, and there was no constant patrol in that area. If someone came, it would take too long. Outside, I heard the man breathe again, close enough to carry through the glass. He didn't seem rushed. He seemed patient. I remained crouched behind the counter, my leg muscles beginning to ache from the tension of staying still. Outside, I heard a slight dragging sound on the deck, as if he had shifted his weight or taken a half step to the side. The wood answered with a short creak dampened by moisture. I tried to visualize his position relative to the windows. The house wasn't large, and the back deck ran almost the entire length of the kitchen and living room wall. If he wanted, he could look through any small gap in the curtains. The worst part wasn't knowing he was there. It was not knowing if he could see me in the dark. The wind increased for a few seconds, making the waves hit harder against the rocks. In that interval, I heard something that confirmed my fear. The sound of water dripping from fabric onto wood. He had come out of the sea recently. Then the voice came again, closer to the back door. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't sound angry. He said he knew I was trying to disappear for a while and that it wouldn't work. That twisted my stomach in a different way. I hadn't told anyone about my plans or the reason I rented that house. I hadn't posted photos. I hadn't spoken to close friends. The only entity that knew my location was the real estate agency, and even then, no one should have had immediate access to that information. My brain began running through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Outside, I heard a short metallic sound from the side of the deck, as if he had rested something on the railing. I didn't know if it was a tool or just keys, but it didn't sound accidental. A real physical pressure built in my chest. Not just psychological fear, but something tangible, as if the air inside the house were getting heavier. He went silent for a few seconds after mentioning I was trying to disappear. The wind eased slightly and the sound of the waves grew more distant, making every noise from the deck more pronounced. I heard 2 slow steps moving away from the back door toward the side of the house. The wood made that low sound typical of adult weight distributed carefully. He was circling again, likely evaluating another entry point. I rose slowly, keeping my body low, and moved toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. My idea was simple. Stay out of the direct line of any window, even in the dark. The house felt smaller than before, more fragile. When he reached the front again, I heard the porch creak under his weight. The front doorknob was tested once more, longer this time with a slight pull and push that made the internal latch vibrate. I was far from the door, but I could hear metal pressing against metal. He wasn't trying brute force. He was evaluating. Then came the third message. The vibration nearly made me drop the phone. I looked at the screen. Another photo. This time the image showed the back deck empty, taken from a more distant point, probably from the water or a boat slightly offshore. The caption read, "I'm not alone." My entire body went cold. I hadn't heard more than one person walking, but that message changed everything. If someone else was in the water, it meant that while one stood on the deck, another could be watching from a different angle. I stood in the dark hallway trying to hear anything beyond the single set of footsteps I had identified. The man on the porch spoke again, saying I could open the door and solve this quickly. His tone remained too calm. That was what destabilized me the most. He sounded comfortable, as if time was on his side. I began seriously considering that my boat, my only way out, might be being tampered with at that very moment. I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to run to the back deck and check the shoreline. But I held back. If there were indeed more than one person outside, leaving the house was exactly what they wanted. Instead, I moved to the small side hallway window, which gave a partial angle toward the shallower side of the peninsula. With extreme care, I moved the curtain a few millimeters to see without exposing myself. The moonlight reflected unevenly on the water's surface. Between the reflections, I could distinguish something dark and low, almost merged with the water. It didn't look like a fixed rock. It looked like a small vessel, maybe with the engine off, drifting in controlled silence. I couldn't clearly see anyone there. But the absence of light was too strategic to be coincidence. As I tried to focus my eyes in the dark, I heard footsteps again on the front deck, followed by a light dragging sound as if something had been leaned against the outer wall. Not enough force to break anything, but the kind of contact that sends a message. "We're here." My phone vibrated again. I didn't want to look. But I did. The fourth message was just a period. Nothing else. That gave me the clear sense that he was monitoring my reaction in real time, maybe waiting for me to respond, maybe waiting for me to make a mistake. His breathing outside grew more audible for a few seconds, as if he was very close to the door again. Then I heard something different from the back of the house, a stronger sound of water being displaced, not a natural wave. It sounded like someone climbing from wet rocks onto the deck. That meant at least one of them was effectively behind the house at that moment. The wood responded with 2 short creaks confirming weight on it. My hands went cold. My plan changed instantly. Instead of trying to observe, I needed to appear absent. I went to the bedroom, grabbed my backpack, already partially organized, and silently turned off any small source of light still active, including the portable router. I stayed in the bedroom, away from the windows, waiting for any sign of forced entry. The man at the front of the house spoke again, now with slight impatience, asking if I was going to pretend not to be there all night. I didn't respond. Inside, absolute silence. Outside, the footsteps began to retreat slowly, first from the front porch, then from the back deck. It wasn't running. It was calculated withdrawal. A few seconds later, I heard a clearer sound from the water, a small engine trying to start. It failed on the first attempt, like it was cold. On the second, it caught. The sound was low, almost whispered, but steady enough to recognize. I remained motionless until the engine's hum faded too far to distinguish from the current. I didn't move immediately. I waited several more minutes in the dark, listening for any sudden return. Nothing. When I finally gathered the courage to approach the window again, the water's surface was empty, except for the moon's reflection now lower in the sky. Silence returned to the natural rhythm of the peninsula. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was the kind that comes after something has been tested. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bedroom floor until the first gray light appeared on the horizon. When dawn brightened enough to reveal details, I went to the back deck. There were clear marks of wet feet on the wood. They weren't old. The water was still fresh, forming irregular trails from the edge of the deck to the wall of the house. I followed them with my eyes until they ended near the glass door. On the front porch, there were also marks, less wet but defined. What marked me most wasn't the presence of footprints. It was their direction. They came from the shoreline, not from the dirt path, not from the road. The person, or people, had come directly from the water, circled the entire house, and positioned themselves exactly in the blind spots of the windows. They knew where I was hiding inside. They knew I wouldn't open the door. They knew my boat was the only way out, and they came anyway, in a place that should have been impossible to trace.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.